Hello, Liz Priestley.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And your exhibition is The Solitary and the Sublime. It's at the Milk Factory Gallery in Beryl in New South Wales. And all of the works, if I'm understanding correctly, all of the works in the exhibition are encaustic works. Now, for people who may not be completely familiar with encaustic as a medium and as a process, what is it? How do you do it?
Yeah. Well, Richard, that's a very good question. Encaustic doesn't have as large a following as a medium here in Australia as what it does in mostly America in the past, but it is garnering more interest from artists here, and more artists are starting to use it. You can get a lot more suppliers here too of encaustic medium, but encaustic essentially, very simply, in its most basic form, is beeswax. So it's essentially beeswax that's been cleaned and sometimes bleached or whitened. You mix it with other hardness, and then essentially you can tint it. Some people use dry pigments. I like to use oil paints. And in my studio setup, quite literally what I have is a couple of hot plates that are switched on, and I have a melted hot medium which I brush immediately onto a hard substrate. So I generally paint on board or paper that's been taped down onto board or mounted onto board. So essentially it is just melted beeswax.
So in a way, you're kind of making your own paint, your own colours with this blend of perhaps traditional oil paints and melted beeswax. But how did you come to this process, and why did you decide to adopt it so enthusiastically?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's funny. I think I must have read about it at some point when I started painting again in my late 20s. Really what was driving me was just playing with pretty much any medium I could find, getting my hands on any kind of medium I could find, and that drove a lot of my enthusiasm, like as far as wanting to create. And I'm pretty sure at some point I must have read about it, and then when I was actually traveling through Italy, I actually came across some encaustic medium, and I brought that back, and I initially started using it because I loved getting texture into my work. So initially I started using it just as a tool, as a vehicle to be able to get texture into my work. And as I worked with it more and more and more, I realised, oh, surely I should be able to use this purely as the main body of the work. And so over time, I basically read and experimented to get that archival quality as well. And I love the quality of the light that penetrates the layers, and it's such an amazing medium. There is so much you can do with it.
Well,
It can be incredibly.
let's go to a couple of specific works so we can talk about that. From the exhibition, Cloud Connection 2 and To the Other Side 1 are the names of the works. And by the way, a reminder for viewers who might be looking at this, ideally, if you can watch and listen to this interview at the same time as being on the gallery website and looking at the images for the exhibition, that will help the context of the discussion. But looking at a couple of works like that, what are we seeing? Describe to us what we're seeing in these kind of landscapes.
So for Cloud Connection and those particular ones, I like to call them my Cloudscapes. So essentially, physically, as a work, technically what I've done is an underpainting, which then is multiple layers of wax, which I then scrape back into to reveal underlayers. And with the Cloudscapes, I like to let them describe themselves so that they come about of their own volition. I know in my mind that this is what I'm doing as a cloudscape, but I usually have an idea of a mood or a feeling that I want to get across. But with those particular ones, I've used multiple layers of translucent wax with also alternating layers of oils as well. And then I finish off with a couple of other mediums, which I won't so much go into. You like to keep a few secrets, but essentially that is it. That is it. So it's multiple translucent layers of wax. Yeah.
And what would you say that the landscapes are based on? Are they essentially landscapes of the imagination, or are they based on places that you've seen and want to share?
Yeah. Well, look, Richard, the thing is over the years, I have exhibited in Beryl, and I always love the landscape there, especially in winter. It has a very European aesthetic, which I love. It's such a contrast where I live in Manila, which can be quite sort of scrubby and more that traditional feel of the Australian landscape. And so Beryl, I just sort of thought, well, that would be a lovely point to start at. And I have to admit, with this exhibition, it became an exhibition of two halves in some ways. So there's images that I've definitely started with, which will be definitely recognisable. They're certainly not based in total realism, but there are starting points. There's an image, view from the bridge, which is taken from Berrima, places like that, Kangaloon. So there was a definite starting point of Beryl. And then as I do, I tend to go off piste and then end up at an entirely different point. So then it becomes about an interpretation and a feeling of that emotion of being in that landscape. So it's, people will see there's a definite difference between that more representational style of landscapes that are recognisable from Beryl.
You mentioned a European sensibility, a sense of European landscapes, and I think that would probably apply to the clouds as well. One might feel that they are to some extent Constable clouds or Turner skies. Are they influences?
Oh, definitely. As I've said in the past, I grew up with the archetypal Constable print that my mother just loved, and it was a beautiful image. And I grew up with a very English grandmother who also painted. And the first thing I did when I got to London, when I was about 25, was went to the Tate and just saw room after room after room of Turners. And you're just struck by the absolute genius of the man. And those images, they just draw you in. So yeah, from both just on a very personal level, and then later on as I've been able to see works in the flesh, it's definite influences, absolutely. Yeah.
You're casting your mind back there to memories of those times in slightly younger days in Europe. But memory is something which I know you cite as being very important in the works, not perhaps in a literal sense, but how does the process of evoking memory play an important role in the works for you?
Well, it has occurred to me over time. My husband always says that I seem to remember things from my childhood that, at the age of 2 or 3 that he's astounded by. But I remember growing up out the other side of Tamworth, south of Tamworth, and seeing storms coming over and being so struck by them, and especially being out in such an open landscape at the time. We lived out on in a house that was on a farm, and I think it just always struck me as something very primordial that I loved. I loved that intensity of it. And over the years, and especially as I've tried to get back to that place of trying to evoke that memory through these sorts of works, I've realised, and again, as I was saying too, being influenced by my mother, my grandmother, you sort of think there is that collective memory that must come down through the generations. It must be there. And I think, I don't know, for me, that's where I feel that spiritual connection comes from, is that idea of collective memory. I think that's the best way I could describe it. Yeah.
Let's go to another work now, Last Light of the Day, because there are some works on paper, as you mentioned in the exhibition, and this is a work on paper. Does paper make different demands of the medium than a more solid surface?
For sure, for sure. Obviously, you can't be as rigorous with it. So the works on board, I can get right into them. I can carve right back into them, scrape right back into them. The works on paper, they need to be more immediate, more spontaneous in some ways, because you can't really afford to put as many layers into the work. So they do tend to have a looser feel, more of a feel of a study. There are larger works on paper that I've done that are more involved, but in general, I also like being able to work on paper because it does force me to be a little more spontaneous. And obviously the logistics as well of taking it from a taped board to mounting it so it can be framed in itself can be a challenge. But depending on the paper that you use and the body of the paper, then you can, there's still a lot that you can do on the paper, yeah.
You mentioned the process of gouging or scraping at the wax surface on a more solid board, and I'd love to come to that a little bit more in a moment. But going to another specific work, Fragmented, there seem to be almost elements of iridescence in that work. How much control do you have of those sort of things, which I'm assuming might be an artifact of type, but how much can you choose to move towards that artifact that you want?
Yes. Over time, because obviously I've become experienced with the medium, I know how different layers of colours will influence each other. And so most of the time, I have a definite sense of control. The final layers and those mediums that I use at the end definitely are a lot looser and sometimes have their own will. And obviously it's like everything. Sometimes you'll be working on something, you have something very much in your mind that you want to get across. You get 3/4 of the way through it and you just go, oh, what happened there? That was not remotely what I was after. But the beauty of this medium is that through reworking something, you actually do get that lovely sense at the end of the work that you realise that in actual fact a lot more has come through. Like you say, that history of what's behind the finished work can be such a lovely aspect of encaustic because of just the layers and that finished product. Yeah, you're struck by it yourself sometimes, especially with different lighting, and you pick out different things that you might not have seen before.
Let's talk about that sense of layering in just a second, but I'm going to get you're just slipping slightly out of the frame, so I'm going to get you to move slightly to your right. You've just been just a little on the move, but there we are. You're just a little better placed now. Because I'd like to talk about that sense of layering as you build things up. And you mentioned also the scraping, the erosion, that building of layers, almost like sedimentation, the scraping away, the erosion. In many ways, you seem to be echoing geological processes. Are you aware of that?
Sometimes yes, because sometimes you do get that sense of rocks and hills that just come out of nowhere that you weren't particularly looking for. And so, yes, that archaeological feel, as you were saying, can come about quite spontaneously. But I have to admit, on the whole, what I really enjoy is usually earlier on in the process is actually the subtlety of what you can actually get from fine curls of wax that you can lift off the surface. And so you get a very fine gradation that you just can't get with any other medium. A very fine gradation between layers. Yeah, which is lovely. Yeah.
It seems to be a medium that offers a great deal of potential for you to be able very physically to be involved. You were talking then about that quite fine process of scraping wax off. Does it ever get really vigorous? Do you ever get really stuck into it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And even physically, because you have to, you might have a metre by a metre board, like the one that's behind me, and you have to actually lay it down to brush on your wax, or I'll do that initially. to brush on your wax, depending on the effect that you want. And then you have to lift it back up onto an easel to be able to get back into it and scrape into it and keep working on it. And also get back from it and see where you're at. And then you have to lay it back down again, brush on more medium, then put it back up again, scrape back into it again, get back from it. So it becomes very, very, very physical. And yeah, some of the tools that I use also too, it's very satisfying, very satisfying.
It sounds like a wonderfully active process and of course, a wonderfully creative one as well. So Liz Priestley, thank you very much for sharing your exhibition.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you.